The elevator opened on the 42nd floor of the Atlantis Tower, and Suzette Aiken stepped out into a silence, the kind of quiet that costs money to maintain. She smoothed her blazer and reminded herself why she was here. For Malcolm. She'd rehearsed the words 100 times on the drive over. He's not the boy you left behind. He's a good man. He loves me. All he wants is for you to be at the wedding. What she hadn't rehearsed was what to do if none of those things turned out to be accurate. Denzel Baxter's penthouse office was exactly what she'd expected. Walls of glass, the city sprawling beneath him like a map of everything he owned. He was standing at the window when she was shown in, and he didn't turn around immediately. He let her stand there. She suspected he let everyone stand there. He was older than she'd imagined, in his 70s maybe, still broad through the shoulders, silver-haired. When he finally turned, his eyes moved over her with an appraiser's precision, not unkind but thorough. Suzette, he said, not Miss Aiken, not hello, just her name like he already knew her well enough to skip the formality. Mr. Baxter, she extended her hand. Thank you for agreeing to see me. He shook it once firmly and gestured toward the seating area. 2 leather chairs angled toward each other across a low table. A tea service was already waiting. She wondered how long it had been sitting there. I know why you're here, he said, settling into his chair. Malcolm knows you're here? No. She met his eyes. He'd have told me not to come. Something shifted in Denzel's expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of careful attention. Like she'd said something that changed the shape of the conversation. He would have, Denzel agreed. Sit down, Suzette. She started the way she'd planned. The wedding date 3 weeks out, the venue, the family she'd pictured gathering at the altar, the way Malcolm never talked about his father, but how she could see it in him sometimes. The absence of the man like a room in his life, he kept the door locked on. She told Denzel that she believed it wasn't too late, that she believed in second chances, that she'd built a career reading numbers, and she'd learned that most deficits could be recovered from if you caught them early enough. Denzel listened without interrupting. He poured tea for them both without being asked. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You're good, he said finally. Composed, warm without being soft. He paused. Malcolm always did have good taste. Mr. Baxter, I'm not going to the wedding, Suzette. The words landed flat. She'd prepared for resistance, had planned a second wave, a third. But the way he said it wasn't cruel or dismissive. It was careful, like a man who'd made a decision he didn't enjoy. I need you to understand something, he continued, leaning forward and lacing his fingers together. I didn't cut my son off because I was a bad father. I cut him off because I found out what he'd done, and once I found out, I couldn't unknow it. A cold feeling moved through her. What are you talking about? Denzel reached across to the side table and picked up a thin manila folder. He didn't open it. He just held it. 3 years before Malcolm launched Baxter Industries, before the angel investors, before the IPO, before every profile in every magazine called him a self-made visionary, he came to me. He needed seed capital, $120,000. He set the folder down in front of her. I said no. We'd been arguing about the direction of my company. I was wrong to mix those things together, and I know that, but I said no. He told me you refused to support him, Suzette said carefully, that you wanted him to take over your company instead of building his own. That's true, and I was wrong. A muscle worked in Denzel's jaw. But what Malcolm didn't tell you, what he's never told anyone, is where he got the $120,000 after I turned him down. Suzette's hands were very still in her lap. He had a business partner, Denzel said, a man named Roy Celestin, a childhood friend. They'd grown up on the same street, played basketball together, the whole story. Roy was working 2 jobs at the time, day shift at a distribution warehouse, nights doing books for a small restaurant group. He'd been saving since he was 19 years old, had $138,000 set aside for a house. His grandmother was living in a rental, and Roy had promised her that he'd buy her a place she could die in, something that belonged to her. Suzette felt the cold sensation spreading. Roy believed in Malcolm, Denzel continued. Believed in him the way only an old friend can, completely without evidence. He gave Malcolm $120,000 of that money. No contract, no equity paperwork, a handshake and a promise that once the company got off the ground, Malcolm would pay him back and then some, give him a stake. And Baxter Industries went public 4 years later at a valuation of $600 million. Denzel opened the folder now, copies of emails, what looked like old bank statements, a notarized letter. Roy never saw a cent. When he came to Malcolm, first politely, then urgently, then desperately, Malcolm told him there was no record of any agreement, that Roy had made a gift, that if Roy pursued it, Malcolm's legal team would make the process so long and so expensive that Roy would spend more fighting it than he'd ever recover. The room tilted slightly. Roy's grandmother died in a rented apartment in 2019, Denzel said quietly. Roy is still renting. He's 41 years old. Suzette stared at the documents. Her brain, trained for 12 years on numbers and discrepancies and the particular way fraud tried to hide itself in the columns, was already reading, already recognizing. How did you find out? She asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. Roy wrote to me not to expose Malcolm, just to ask me if I could intervene. He still believed, even after everything, that maybe Malcolm just needed someone to remind him of who he used to be. Denzel's voice was dry, but not cruel. I confronted Malcolm. He didn't deny it. He said Roy had misunderstood the nature of their arrangement and that the matter was settled. He paused. He said it the way you'd say a meeting had been rescheduled. Suzette looked up from the documents. That was 4 years ago, Denzel said. That's when I stopped speaking to my son, not because he made a ruthless business decision, I've made those, but because of the way he looked at me when I asked him how he could do that to Roy. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't even uncomfortable. He just looked at me like I was asking him to explain something very simple that I was struggling to understand. He straightened. I didn't recognize him, Suzette, and that scared me more than anything I've done in 40 years of business. She sat with the folder in her lap for a long time after that. Denzel didn't fill the silence. He'd said what he had to say, and he seemed like a man who'd learned that some silences were not his to fix. Finally, she asked, Is Roy Celestin findable? I have his contact information, Denzel said. I've been supporting him quietly, anonymously, for the last 3 years. It doesn't undo it, but it's what I could do. He looked at her steadily. I'm not telling you what decision to make, young lady. I'm telling you what I know. What you do with it is yours. Suzette set the folder back on the table. She looked at her hands. At the ring on her left hand, the diamond Malcolm had produced at the restaurant where they'd had their first date. The gesture so precisely calibrated to her that she'd cried and thought, this man knows me. She thought about Roy Celestin's grandmother, the rented apartment, the promise broken so cleanly it left no visible seam. She thought about the way Malcolm sometimes talked about his origin story, the early years, the scrappiness, the I built this with nothing, and she thought about how much easier it is to tell that story when you've erased the person who handed you the foundation. She stood. Thank you for seeing me, she said. Denzel stood too. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her it would work out. He just extended his hand again, and when she shook it, he held it a half-second longer than before. Not an embrace, but something close to one. For what it's worth, he said, I think Malcolm is very lucky that you came here. She didn't ask what he meant by that. She already knew. In the elevator going down, she watched her own reflection in the mirrored doors. 42 floors, enough time to think. 3 weeks to the wedding, to a man she thought she knew, $120,000, and a grandmother who never got her house. Suzette Aiken was a payroll accountant. She spent her days making sure every number was where it was supposed to be, that every debt was recorded, that nothing disappeared into the columns without leaving a mark. She pressed the lobby button. She had some calls to make. She sat in her car for 22 minutes before she drove anywhere. She knew it was 22 minutes because she watched the clock on her dashboard the way she sometimes watched a spreadsheet when a number was wrong, but she hadn't yet found where, waiting for the thing to reveal itself. The folder sat on the passenger seat. Denzel had let her take copies. Of course he had. He'd had them prepared before she arrived. She thought about that. The man had known she was coming, and he'd had documents ready, not to ambush her, she didn't think, but because he was a man who understood that the truth needed evidence or it was just a story. He'd given her the evidence. What she built with it was up to her. She pulled out of the parking garage at 2:14 p.m. and drove to the public library on Calder Street because it was the first quiet place she thought of, and she needed somewhere that wasn't her apartment, wasn't the office, wasn't anywhere Malcolm associated with her. She sat at a table near the window with her phone face down in front of her. Then she turned it over and searched for Roy Celestin. He wasn't difficult to find. He had a LinkedIn profile that told its own quiet story. Warehouse operations manager, the same company for 9 years, a sparse summary that read like a man who'd stopped trying to make himself sound ambitious. His photo showed someone around Malcolm's age, square jaw, careful eyes, a smile that had clearly been produced for the camera. She stared at his face for a long time. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She requested to connect, and in the message field she typed, "My name is Suzette Aiken. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance. I would very much like to speak with you if you're open to it. I'm sorry to reach out this way. I didn't know another way." She put the phone down. It buzzed 40 minutes later. "I know who you are." A pause in the typing she imagined. "Malcolm mentioned you, said he was getting married." Another pause. "I'll talk to you, but I need to know why." Suzette looked out the library window at the street below. A woman was pushing a stroller. Two teenagers were laughing about something on a phone screen. The city moved the way it always moved, without any awareness of the specific weight one person was carrying at a given moment. She typed back, "Because I need to know who I'm marrying." Roy Celestin called her the next morning. He had a measured voice, the voice of someone who'd learned to keep his feelings on a shorter leash than they used to be. He didn't dramatize. He didn't ask for sympathy. He told her the story the same way she imagined he'd had to tell it to himself over the years, stripped of its emotion, reduced to its facts. The savings, the handshake, the early years of watching Baxter Industries grow in the business press while his calls went to voicemail, the letter from Malcolm's legal team that arrived on a Tuesday in October that was so polite and so final that he'd had to read it 3 times before he understood what it was. "I want to ask you something," Suzette said when he finished. "Go ahead. Did he know, when he took the money, did he know he wasn't going to pay you back?" A silence. "I used to tell myself no," Roy said, "for a long time. Because if I believed he knew, then I had to believe I'd handed my grandmother's house to someone who looked me in the eye and calculated it." He paused. "But there was never any paperwork. He kept saying we'd formalize it later, when the business was stable, when the accountants had time, and I kept believing him because he was Malcolm. I'd known him since we were 11 years old." Another pause, longer. "I think he knew." Suzette closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "You didn't do anything." "I know, I'm still sorry." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I needed to hear it from you." "Why?" She considered the question. "Because documents can be explained away. People are harder to explain away." She went to work the next 3 days as though nothing had changed. She was good at that, another skill honed over years of being the person in the room who found the problems others had missed. You learned to maintain a neutral face. You learned that the moment you changed your expression, whoever was hiding something would know you'd found it, and they'd start moving assets before you could count them. Malcolm called every evening. They talked about the caterer, about his cousin's flight from Atlanta, about whether the ceremony should include a unity candle or whether that was too dated. She answered every question. She laughed in the right places. She said "I love you" when they hung up, and she meant some version of it. The version that existed before the 42nd floor, before a man's quiet voice telling her about a promise broken so surgically it barely bled. On the 4th night, she asked him about Roy. She didn't plan it as an ambush. She hadn't even fully decided she was going to do it. They were on the phone, mid-conversation, and she heard herself say, "Hey, didn't you used to have a friend named Roy? Roy Celestin? You mentioned him once, I think. Early on?" There was a quick pause. "Yeah," Malcolm said. "We grew up together. We grew apart. You know how it is. You know how it is." 4 words, weightless, designed to close a door. "What happened between you two?" "Nothing dramatic. People change. Business gets complicated." She could hear him shifting, a chair moving. Why are you asking about Roy? I don't know. I was thinking about the wedding, about how you don't really have an old friend coming, someone who knew you before all of this. She paused just long enough. It made me a little sad for you. Another pause. I'm fine, Suze. Not everybody stays in your life forever. She said good night and set the phone down on the nightstand and sat in the dark for a very long time. He hadn't lied. He'd done something more sophisticated than lying. He'd told just enough truth to walk through the question without tripping on it. People change. Business gets complicated. All technically accurate. All carefully chosen to reveal nothing. She thought about what Denzel had said. He just looked at me like I was asking him to explain something very simple that I was struggling to understand. She met Malcolm for dinner on Friday. His choice of restaurant, always his choice, which she'd found romantic and was now re-examining. He was in good spirits, present in the way he always was when things were going well for him at work, when the version of himself he liked best was ascendant. He was beautiful when he was like this. She'd never stopped finding him beautiful. She held that fact alongside everything else and found it complicated. Halfway through the main course, she set down her fork. I went to see your father, she said. The candlelight between them didn't change. The restaurant didn't shift. Malcolm put down his wine glass with the careful precision of a man making sure not to put it down too hard. When? He said. Monday. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have told me not to go. She held his gaze. And I needed to go. He looked at her for a moment, and there it was, the thing Denzel had described, a recalibration happening behind his eyes while his face stayed perfectly still. And what did he tell you? Malcolm asked. He told me about Roy Celestin. Malcolm didn't flicker. He told you Roy's version of events, Malcolm said evenly. My father has always believed whatever makes me look worse, I spoke to Roy. That landed, and she watched it land. A very small impact, a tightening around his eyes, there and gone in under a second. Then the stillness returned. Suzette, his voice shifted into something lower, warmer, the register he used when he was about to be very reasonable. Roy and I had a falling out over a business disagreement that my father decided to weaponize because he saved that money for 12 years, Malcolm. Her voice was quiet. For his grandmother. You knew that. You knew exactly what that money was when you took it. What I knew, he said, each word measured, was that Roy was making an investment in something he believed in. Investments carry risk. They're not guarantees, no matter what a handshake feels like in the moment. He wasn't an investor. He was your friend, and you treated him like a line item. There was silence, and Malcolm looked at her across the candle. She saw it again, the thing Denzel had tried to describe. The expression of a man running a quiet calculation. I built something, he said finally. Something real. Something that employs 300 people. Whatever Roy and I went through, whatever my father told you, doesn't erase that. I didn't say it did. Then what are you saying? Suzette picked up her fork and put it back down. Then she looked at the ring on her hand. I'm saying I needed to know who I was marrying, she said. And now I do. And who am I? His voice was even, the voice of a man who never let a question go unanswered on someone else's terms. You're someone who can take $120,000 from a man who trusted you with everything he had, she said quietly, and look him in the eye afterward, and then look me in the eye every day and never mention it and feel nothing either time. You don't know what I feel. Then tell me. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me you lost sleep over it. Tell me you picked up the phone 100 times and couldn't go through with it. Tell me there is one moment, just one moment, where Roy Celestin's face in your mind cost you something. The candlelight moved between them. Malcolm didn't answer. Not because he was searching for the right words. She understood that now. He didn't answer because there wasn't an answer that was also the truth, and he was, whatever else he was, too precise to tell a lie she could see through. I need some time, Suzette said. She stood, picked up her purse, set $300 on the table, enough to cover dinner because she was, at her core, a woman who settled her accounts. She walked out of the restaurant and onto the street and stood in the warm evening air and breathed. 3 weeks to the wedding. She had a dress hanging in her apartment, a seating chart on her laptop, and 214 people expecting to watch her walk down an aisle. Somewhere across the city, a man named Roy Celestin in a rented apartment, still paying for a belief he'd had in someone when they were both 11 years old, and the world had not yet taught him that some people learn how to look like the person you love without ever quite becoming them. Suzette started walking. She didn't know yet what she was going to do, but she knew this. She was a woman who made sure every number was where it was supposed to be, and somewhere in Malcolm Baxter's ledger, there was a debt that had never been recorded. She was going to decide what to do about that. She gave herself the weekend. That was the deal she made with herself on the walk back from the restaurant 2 days before she made any decision that couldn't be unmade. 2 days to sit with what she knew and separate what she felt from what she could prove and what she intended to do, because those were 3 different columns, and she had learned a long time ago never to let them bleed into each other. Malcolm called Saturday morning. She let it go to voicemail. He texted at noon. "Take whatever time you need. I love you. I'm not going anywhere." She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down and went to make coffee. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the neighborhood below, the Saturday rhythms of it, the dog walkers and the corner store delivery, and the elderly man on the 3rd floor of the building opposite who sat in his window every morning with a newspaper, even though she was fairly sure he couldn't see well enough to read it anymore. He just liked the posture of it, the ritual of holding something and looking out at the world. She understood that now more than she used to. By Sunday evening, she had made her decision. It surprised her. She had expected to arrive somewhere clean, a simple yes or no. Call the wedding off or don't. Instead, what she arrived at was something more complex, more true, and considerably more frightening. She picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Roy Celestin. The second was to Denzel Baxter. She asked them both the same question. "Would you be willing to be in a room with Malcolm if I arranged it?" Roy was quiet for so long she thought the call had dropped. "Why?" he finally asked. "Because I think there are 2 ways this ends," she said. "One of them leaves you exactly where you are. The other one doesn't." She paused. "I can't promise you anything, but I've spent 12 years in rooms where people hoped uncomfortable truths would stay buried, and I've learned that the only way to change the account is to open it in front of everyone." Another silence. "All right," Roy said. Denzel was easier. He said yes before she'd finished the question. She called Malcolm on Monday morning. "I want to talk," she said. "Not on the phone. Come to my apartment tonight, 7 o'clock. "Suzette." "Please, Malcolm." It wasn't a plea. He came at 7. He was dressed well, as he always was, and he'd brought flowers, pale pink ones, her favorite, and she accepted them because discarding them would have been theatrical. She had no interest in theater. She put them in water, then offered him coffee. He declined. They sat in her living room across from each other in the same chairs they'd sat in 100 times, and for a moment it looked almost normal, almost like the people they'd been 6 days ago. "I need to tell you what I've decided," she said. "Okay." He laced his fingers together, still and composed, his face arranged in the expression she now understood was not calm but control. "I'm not calling the wedding off." Something shifted in him. Relief, she thought, or the precursor to it. "But I'm not going forward with it either, not yet, not until something happens first." She held his gaze. "On Thursday evening, I've asked your father and Roy Celestin to come here, to this apartment, and I'm asking you to be here too." The relief dissolved. "Absolutely not," he said. Quiet and final, the voice he used in boardrooms, she imagined, when a proposal was being declined. "I'm not negotiating it, Malcolm. I'm telling you." "You're telling me." He looked at her steadily. "You've been speaking to my father and to Roy behind my back, and now you're telling me to show up to some kind of—" "Intervention isn't the right word," she said. "I've been thinking about what word fits, and I don't think one exists. What it is a debt being opened in front of the people it involves." She paused. "I work in payroll. Do you know what happens when a company discovers an account that was never properly recorded? We don't just quietly adjust the books. We document it. We trace it back to its origin. We make it official. Because the only way a debt is real is if it's recorded. If you made it this far, you already know you're a story junkie. Hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's feed that addiction together. A new story is always waiting for you here. Malcolm stared at her. You want me to sit across from Roy Celestin and tell the truth. Her voice didn't waver. Whatever version of it you're capable of. I have told you the truth. You told me a truth. You told me the version of events that kept you intact. She leaned forward slightly. Malcolm, I have spent 12 years finding the numbers that people hoped I wouldn't find. I know what it looks like when an account has been managed rather than honest. I know the difference between a man who made a mistake and is carrying it, and a man who made a decision and filed it away. She paused. You filed it away, and I need to know if there's any part of you that is capable of opening it again, because if there isn't, if you sit in that chair right now and tell me there is nothing in you that wants to account for what you did to Roy, then I have my answer, and we won't need Thursday. The room was very quiet. Malcolm looked at the coffee table between them, then at his hands, then finally at her, and for the first time since the restaurant, she saw something different move across his face. He looked for just a moment like the man she'd fallen in love with. I know what I did, he said. I know you do. Knowing it and performing it in front of an audience. It's not a performance, that's exactly my point. She held his gaze. A real accounting is one that happens in front of the people it affected, not a private acknowledgement in my living room that costs you nothing, not a donation your father makes on your behalf to ease the books. She paused. Roy Celestin is 41 years old and he's still renting an apartment because he believed in you when you were both nobody. You owe him more than a quiet admission to your fiancée. Malcolm was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Lower, the architecture of control still present but thinner, like load-bearing walls that had been standing too long. And if I come Thursday, he said, if I sit in that room, then what? You forgive me, we get married, it's over. I don't know, she said honestly. That depends on what happens in the room. It depends on whether Roy walks out with something that resembles justice. It depends on whether I see the person I thought you were, or whether I confirm the person I'm afraid you are. She paused. I can't promise you a clean outcome, Malcolm. I can only promise you that this is the only path I can see that leads anywhere worth going. Malcolm stood. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her the way his father had stood when she'd walked into the penthouse on the 42nd floor. And she thought about how much of us is our parents even when we've spent years trying to outrun them. He stood there for a long time. Then he asked, what time Thursday? They arrived within minutes of each other. Denzel first, punctual and contained in a dark overcoat, nodding once at Suzette and taking the chair she indicated without ceremony. Roy next, and she felt the change in the room the moment he walked in. He was taller than she'd expected, quieter in his body. He looked at her apartment the way people look at spaces that belong to someone connected to a wound, carefully, cataloguing, making sure the territory was safe. He saw the flowers on the counter, Malcolm's pale pink flowers, and his expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened once, briefly. Thank you for coming, she said. You said it might matter, Roy said. I decided to believe you. She poured water for everyone, and then she went to the door and opened it, and Malcolm was standing in the hallway. He looked at her and she looked at him. They're both here, she said quietly. He nodded and stepped inside. The moment Malcolm crossed the threshold, Roy Celestin looked up and their eyes met. Suzette stopped breathing for just a second. There was a history in that look that she was only ever going to understand from the outside. 11-year-old boys on the same street, a shared language built over decades, and then a document arriving on a Tuesday in October. Denzel said nothing. He simply observed. He was, Suzette had realized, very good at that. Malcolm sat down. Nobody spoke for a moment that lasted longer than any moment had a right to. Then Roy said, Why'd you do it? Not how could you? Not do you know what you took from me? Just why? The question of someone who had made peace with the what and still hadn't reached the why. Malcolm looked at the coffee table. Because I was scared, he said. His voice came out differently than Suzette had ever heard it, unpolished, the professional finish stripped off. Because I'd told everyone I was going to build something and I didn't know if I could, and when it started working, When I could see it actually working, I told myself that if I paid you back, it meant admitting how close I'd come to needing you, how close I'd come to failing. He paused. And I didn't want to need anyone. I built the whole thing on not needing anyone. Roy watched him. I wanted to call you, Malcolm said. 100 times. I picked up the phone. He stopped, started again. I didn't, because every time I thought about it, I knew there was no version of that call where I wasn't the man who stole from his oldest friend, and I couldn't figure out how to be that man and still be the man I built. So you just chose, Roy said. You chose to be the other man. Yes. The word dropped into the room like a stone into water. Roy absorbed it. He sat with it the way he'd clearly learned to sit with things, without rushing to the edges of them. My grandmother's name was Cecile, Roy said quietly. She used to make this sweet potato pie every Sunday. She put nutmeg in it. I can't eat sweet potato pie anymore. He looked at Malcolm steadily. She died in a rented apartment on a Tuesday morning. I was the one who found her, and I stood in that room, and all I could think was that I'd broken a promise to her. He paused. You made me break a promise to her. Malcolm's face, composed for so long, so perfectly arranged, came undone. His eyes reddened. He didn't wipe at them. He seemed to think he didn't deserve to wipe at them. I know, he said. The two smallest words she'd ever heard come out of him. That's all you've got? Roy asked. No, Malcolm looked up. I want to make it right. Whatever that looks like. Whatever number we agree on. Not what an attorney would negotiate. Not a settlement. Just what would have been yours. The original amount, the interest, the stake I promised you, all of it. He glanced at Denzel briefly, involuntarily, then back to Roy. And I want it in writing, formal, so there's a record, so it's real. Roy was quiet for a long time. That doesn't bring her back, Roy said. I know. I don't want to be your redemption story, Malcolm. I don't want to be the part of your biography where you learned a lesson. You won't be, Suzette said. Both men looked at her. Because if this is going to be documented, she said, I'll be the one doing it, and I'm not a biographer, I'm an accountant. She looked at Roy. Every number in its right place, every debt recorded. That's all I know how to do. She paused. Let me do that for you, properly. Whatever you're owed, let me calculate it and let me put it in writing and let me make sure it's paid. No narrative, no redemption arc. Just the account settled. Roy looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Malcolm. You found a good one, he said finally. Not warmly or bitterly, just as fact, the way Roy Celestin seemed to say most things. I know, Malcolm said. Denzel left first. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Suzette, and she thought he was going to say something significant, something to mark the occasion. Instead, he just said, Good work, in the voice of a man who knew how to recognize competence, then put his hat on and left. Roy stayed a few minutes longer. She walked him to the elevator. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor indicator moving upward toward them. Do you believe him? She asked. Roy considered it. I believe he means it right now, he said. People mean things in rooms like that. The elevator arrived. He stepped in and turned to face her. Whether he still means it in 6 months is a different question. That's why everything will be in writing, she said. Roy almost smiled. Yeah. The doors began to close. Let me know how the wedding goes. Malcolm was still sitting in her living room when she came back. He hadn't moved. He was looking at the pale pink flowers on the counter with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Grief, maybe, or something adjacent to it. The recognition of how much he'd nearly lost, of how much he still might. She sat across from him. I haven't decided, she said, about the wedding. I want you to know that. I know. What happened in this room tonight, that was necessary, that was right, but it doesn't automatically repair what I learned about you. She held his gaze. I need time, real time, not 3 weeks. He nodded slowly. So we postpone. We postpone. He looked at his hands. Will you tell me, is there a version of this where we're okay? Or are you telling me goodbye in stages? Suzette thought about Roy's grandmother making sweet potato pie on Sundays. She thought about Denzel standing at his window 42 floors above the city, alone with what he knew. She thought about 12 years of finding the numbers that didn't add up, and the particular exhaustion of being the person who could never stop looking. She thought about the man across from her, brilliant, flawed, capable of terrible things, and apparently tonight of something that looked like accountability. Whether those things could coexist in a person she could build a life with was not a question she could answer in this room. I don't know, she said. That's the truth, and you know me well enough to know I won't tell you anything other than the truth. Malcolm nodded. He stood, then picked up his jacket. At the door, he stopped and turned back to her. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad you went to see him. I'm glad you were the one who made me open it. He paused. I'd been carrying it for a long time. I know, she said. Debt has a weight, even when you've convinced yourself you filed it away. He left. She stood in the quiet of her apartment, the flowers on the counter, the 4 chairs arranged around her coffee table, the ghost of a conversation that had changed the shape of everything, and she breathed. She didn't know what came next, but every account was open, every number was in its right place, every debt was recorded. For tonight, that was enough. You made it to the end of this story, and I'm grateful for that, truly. Stories like this one don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because real things happen to real people. People who trust, families who fight, systems that fail, and communities that have to decide what to do about that failure. I want to ask you something, and I want you to take a moment with it before you scroll on. Have you ever watched someone get away with something and stayed silent because you didn't think your voice would matter? Or have you ever been the person who said something, did something, made one call or sent one message or told one other person and watched that small act become part of something bigger than you expected? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear it. Not because I'm collecting stories, but because I genuinely believe that the most important thing we have going for us are the people who refuse to look away. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because silence is a choice, and so is everything else. God bless you.